Wes Huff just gave Piers Morgan a golden response to one of the toughest questions that Christians get asked. Do angels and demons actually exist? Now, you might think that this is a pretty tough sell in a world obsessed with science and skepticism, but trust me, Wes didn't just handle it, okay? He absolutely nailed this response. In fact, his response is so powerful that even Piers Morgan himself, who's interviewed everyone from Richard Dawkins to Jordan Peterson, found himself in complete agreement. Now, even though Wes brilliantly dismantled skepticism about the supernatural in his response, there's still one crucial objection his answer doesn't fully resolve. And by the end of this video, I'm going to give you the missing piece. You're going to discover why belief in angels and demons isn't just plausible. It might be more rational than you ever imagined. All right, so here's what happened. Okay, Wes and Piers were right in the middle of this really deep, high-stakes conversation about the evidence for the resurrection when, sort of out of nowhere, Piers decides to throw Wes a pretty big curveball. Okay, he shifts gears and asks about something way outside the usual historical debates: angels and demons. It's the kind of questions that skeptics love because it sounds pretty silly. It can sound pretty silly to a lot of people. But you know what? Let's just watch the clip and see how Wes responds to this very challenging question.
Finally, on the Bible, it also talks about things like angels and demons and stuff like that, which people point to as, well, obviously that can't be true. I mean, what do you say to people when they raise things like angels and demons?
Well, I mean, it's starting with the assumption that the supernatural doesn't exist. And I simply, I don't think that's true. I mean, there are all sorts of things that, from, say, a secular materialistic perspective, are far more of needing an explanation than the existence of supernatural beings. I mean, my friend Glenn Scrivener out in the UK, who runs an organization called Speak Life, he talks about this a lot, where, you know, there are things that atheists and secular materialists have to account for, things like everything coming from nothing, order coming from chaos, life emerging from non-life, minds that, from mindless matter. You know, is it more of a leap in logic to believe in angels and demons, or that everything came from nothing, Piers? That order came from chaos, that life emerged from non-life, and that mind formed from mindless matter? I would say these are answers that arguably, in terms of the topic of what we're, you know, on the eve of Easter, the resurrection is not one more absurdity. Neither are angels or demons, but the resurrection, I think, actually is the explanation that makes sense of the supernatural world that we see talked about in, you know, all sorts of religious perspectives. And I think that people will assume that the supernatural can't exist, and yet at the exact same time, they will, as a conscious human being in a world where we're still not really entirely sure what consciousness is, try to explain logically some of these things when, you know, the rules of logic exist objectively, and yet they are outside of time and matter and space. And so there are obviously things that things like science and secular materialism can't account for. And I have no qualms saying that supernatural beings exist in light of this very strange supernatural world that we live in.
So Wes absolutely nailed this response, all right? He's pointing out something that skeptics conveniently overlook, all right? Namely, that believing in angels and demons isn't really crazier than believing, say, that the universe just kind of like popped into being from nothing. There's no cause of the universe. Like if you're okay believing that chaos randomly produced life, that intelligence came from non-intelligence and produced something like William Lane Craig, then angels and demons aren't exactly a huge stretch. But hold on a second, let's be fair about this. Okay, Wes's response here is a very solid first step. But there's one nagging objection that came to my mind. You might already be thinking it as well. Here it is. Even if we grant that God exists and explains all of these huge origin type questions, like why does the universe exist? Why did life emerge in the first place? Why is consciousness real? It doesn't automatically follow that angels and demons exist. All right, so in other words, why couldn't it just be God and humans without all the other spiritual beings sort of running around? I'm going to answer that question shortly. And when I do, I'm going to actually show you something you probably won't believe until you hear it with your own ears. I recently interviewed a Catholic exorcist who personally witnessed something literally impossible to explain away. Stick around. You do not want to miss that toward the end of this video. But first, let's keep watching Wes and Piers because trust me, it's about to get even better. All right, let's jump back in.
You know what? I completely agree. And it comes back to what I started this interview with, which was when I debate with atheists and so on who mock me for having any kind of faith in God or whatever. I said, well, look, you cannot explain to me what was there before your Big Bang. You cannot explain what was there when it was nothing. You can't even explain what nothing is. So because the human brain cannot understand that, as I said at the start, then to me, there must be super beings, entities out there. And all right, I've chosen, because I was raised as a Catholic, I've chosen to take a certain path of my belief and faith system and so on. But actually, the idea that there can't be anything supernatural when a human brain cannot explain basic things like what was there before your Big Bang or whatever, that to me is the evidence I need. Of course there must be stuff that is more powerful than humans, because otherwise we would be able to explain all that stuff, and we can't.
I think that's exactly right, Pearson. And Joe and I talked about that on my episode on the JRE, in that some people believe in the virgin birth and others believe in the virgin birth of the universe. And so a Big Bang requires a Big Banger. And so I think it's not entirely a leap to find an explanation for that, right? Something like survival of the fittest doesn't explain the arrival of the fittest. There are still explanations for origin questions that I think, we can ascribe it to, like Lawrence Krauss wants to do, nothing. But then he has to define nothing, and you find out he actually doesn't think nothing means no thing. He actually thinks it means something. And so that's exactly right. I think, when we're talking about everything coming from nothing, a finely tuned explosion, that order from chaos, then I think actually when we're looking for the answers to these questions, it was once said, I can't remember exactly who, that the scientists and the philosophers have been climbing the mountains only to find the theologians at the top all the way along.
So here, Wes and Piers are making actually a really key point, okay? One that's really worth slowing down on and digesting very clearly. All right, Wes cleverly says survival of the fittest doesn't explain the arrival of the fittest. But let's think about that, okay? It's actually a brilliant line because evolution by natural selection can tell you how species developed and adapt once they already exist, but it literally can't touch the deeper question about how the stuff got here in the first place. It's kind of like someone asking, well, how did you get that cake? And then you respond by describing how you carefully sliced it. Okay, you're missing the point. We want to know how the cake got baked in the first place to begin with. And this is absolutely crucial because origin questions like why something exists rather than nothing, or how mind came into existence from mindless material, these are enormous questions. They're exactly the kinds of questions that reveal which worldview is more probable on the whole. If your worldview consistently runs into brick walls about these, whenever you ask these sort of basic fundamental questions about the world that we live in, well, maybe it's not the worldview you want to make or stake your eternal destiny on. Now, do you remember the lingering objection from earlier? Even if Christianity answers these big type of origin questions better than atheism does, even if there is a big banger behind the Big Bang, how exactly does that mean that angels and demons exist? Couldn't God simply create the universe without any of these other supernatural creatures? Don't worry, I promised you an answer and it's coming up very shortly. But first, let's watch this final clip with Piers and Wes because things are about to get really spicy.
Yeah, and the other thing about atheists is they must die so unhappy because that's it. Whereas you and I, it's just the beginning.
Well, I would want to instill hope in those atheists and say, you may think this is all there is, but it's not. And, there is so much more than just this. And to really push into some of those more metaphysical, existential questions. How does everything come from nothing? How does order come from chaos? How does life emerge from non-life? How do minds come from mindless matter? And I would really encourage them to say and look into something like the Bible, which I think ultimately gives answers.
Well, I can't wait to meet Richard Dawkins and Ricky Gervais on the other side, just to see their faces and say, you see, I told you.
Well, between you and me, I hope that they come to a place where, on the other side, they're going to be in the same place where I am, and that the "told you so" is grasping it and unity, rather than them maybe going some different direction. So I continue to pray for Ricky Gervais and Richard Dawkins, and have hope that if Jesus can change Paul from being a persecutor of the church, Richard Dawkins is far outside of the realm of possibility of salvation.
Okay, real talk here. Wes's response here is exactly the right approach. And it's also just beautiful. Like when he says that he hopes that even hardcore skeptics like Dawkins and Gervais will eventually choose God, he's hitting on something super, super important for a number of reasons. Ultimately, whether someone embraces God or rejects him is entirely up to them. I love this line from C.S. Lewis. He says, "Hell is locked from the inside." God doesn't force anybody to spend eternity with him. He simply offers the invitation, and it's up to you whether you're going to RSVP. All right, but now let's get back to our lingering objection. All right, remember, okay, we said, even if God explains big origin questions better than atheism, which it does, that still doesn't automatically mean that angels and demons exist. Why couldn't God just create a universe without all of these, special supernatural creatures? Now, here's where things get very, very interesting. First, if you believe, as Christians do, that there's an infinite, immaterial mind behind the universe, it actually becomes less surprising that other finite, immaterial minds exist. Think about it this way. If the fundamental reality is an infinite mind, or God, then finite spiritual beings, angels and demons, fit quite naturally within that picture. In fact, compared to embodied beings like us, purely spiritual beings could even be considered more natural or more expected given theism. Now, full disclosure, I did not always believe that strongly in demons, but then something happened that totally shook my view on the matter. I started personally interviewing exorcists, actual priests, deeply involved in deliverance ministry, and these conversations radically raised my confidence. Okay, and let me give you a taste of what I mean. All right, first, here's a clip from my conversation with Father Dan Rehill, an official exorcist for the Diocese of Nashville, who personally witnessed something that is pretty hard to explain.
I went to see a guy that was at a halfway house up near Kentucky and really had no expectation that there would be a big problem at all. I just got a call from the person that was kind of running the halfway house. Said, "This guy's acting real strange and he's creeping out a lot of the other guys here. Can you come talk to him?" So I went up and I met with him in a room privately. And I just really just in the opening prayer, it wasn't even a prayer of deliverance. It was just, come Holy Spirit and, guide my thoughts and my actions and my ways according to your will. And with that, he just levitated right up off the couch. And I said, "Okay, we're not going to do this here." Imagine you had a rope tied to your belly button and was pulling you up off the ground and your limbs are just flung backwards. It was like he was being pulled up through his core and everything else was just flailing backwards.
But he was on the couch?
Well, he started on the couch.
He started on the couch and then he kind of like got pulled forward?
No, up. He was up in the air with his limbs hanging.
Okay, so he was sitting down and then he just started to levitate. How high up off of the couch did
couple of feet? Levitate?
Okay. Sorry, I just wanted to get a little bit more detail on what the scene kind of looked like. But continue. Feel free to continue.
Well, I knew enough that we're not going to do an actual exorcism on his turf. So I just said, "We're done here." And in the name of Jesus, I command you to stop. He fell back down on the couch. He came back. He was present to me, the young man. And I said, "We're going to have to do this at my church because, this isn't the right place to do this sort of thing." And so we scheduled the appointment and he came down a few times and we did a few sessions and of the actual rite. And I think after 2 or 3, he was fine.
All right, let's be very clear about this. All right, Father Rehill actually saw this guy levitate, or he's just straight up lying. Okay, people don't just accidentally hallucinate human levitation. It's not like mistakenly thinking that you saw someone wave to you across the street. All right, if he's lying, he'd have to be deliberately deceiving everyone that he's ever spoken to about this topic. And while sure, like lying is definitely possible, at some point, that explanation gets stretched way too thin, especially as these sorts of claims start to pile up one after another from totally different people with seemingly nothing to gain. Father Rehill is not asking for interviews. People are asking him for interviews, all right? He's busy like doing his thing as a priest. But I have to remind you, this is not a one-off thing. Like, let me show you another clip, this time from my interview with Dr. Richard Gallagher. Here, Gallagher talks about an incident involving a possessed individual who knew something that was literally impossible to know naturally.
The long and the short of it, when I first met her, I think that was part of your question, Cameron. My wife and I were in our bedroom in our suburban house, and it was 3 a.m., interestingly enough. The two cats...
How long ago was this? Sorry to cut in.
This is a little more now than 25 years or so. We've always had pets, and we had two cats, and they used to sleep at the end of our bed. They were quite well-behaved cats. Cats can be a little ornery, but they were on the gentle and well-behaved side. And all of a sudden, we were awakened by these two cats fiercely fighting each other. Never seen ever before or since. To the point that they were scratching and clawing each other, going at each other like prize fighters, and we had to separate them. And we really didn't know what was going on. I mean, was this catnip or had they eaten something bad? We chalked it up to some kind of natural cause. As it turned out, the next morning, actually to my annoyance, the priest brought this woman, whom I call Julia, to my house. I later told him in no uncertain terms, do not bring Satanists to my neighborhood, okay? So they ring the doorbell, I trudge down the stairs, and Father Jacques, somewhat sheepishly, says to me, well, Dr. Gallagher, I'd like to introduce you to this woman I've been telling you about, Julia. And Julia looks at me with a smirk and says, out of the blue, oh, hi, Dr. Gallagher, nice to meet you. By the way, how did you like those cats last night? Now, you can imagine I was taken aback. I was taken aback so much by her comment that I didn't really express to her the annoyance I had if she had anything to do with this. I'm thinking, how is this possible that she knew that? I'd never met her before.
Every time I watch that clip, it gives me goosebumps. But okay, you can dismiss like one or maybe one or two accounts as deception. But when you get a massive collection of detailed, independently reported experiences like these, you've got to start wondering, like, are these really just a big elaborate lie conspiracy, or are they mistaken? Like, or is something else actually going on here? But look, I get it. Like this stuff is intense. Okay, angels, demons, supernatural events. It can feel really overwhelming, especially if you're hearing it for the first time. But here's the heart of it, okay? We live in a world that is way bigger, way richer, and far more mysterious than we often realize. And sometimes reality pushes back on us to expand what we thought was possible. Now, if you're still unsure about this, I want to sort of gently encourage you, look deeper. Look deeper. Look at the evidence. Check out my other video on 33,000 medically documented miracles attributed to a saint, Saint Charbel. Stuff like this is happening all over the world. You just don't know about it. Miracles like these and other occurrences provide very, very powerful evidence that we're living in a supernatural reality. Okay, there's stuff going on here that atheists cannot explain. But ultimately, this is not just about like fascinating stories or these miracle accounts or philosophical arguments. It's actually about you. Like, if the supernatural world is real and angels and demons truly do exist, then God is real. And if God is real, then your life, your soul, matters far more deeply than you could ever imagine.